So let's now convert this users component to a class-based component. For this, we again should import something from React. Let me restructure these imports. We should import component from React because we now build our users component by creating a class named users, which extends component. That's what I explained in the last lecture, and that's how you always build your class-based components. In there, we can now add a render method. And in that render method, we return the JSX code that should be rendered. So I'll copy this return statement and bring it into my render method. Now we learned that we can access props with this props, but here I'm not working with props. Instead, I'm relying on state, and I'm pointing at a function that should be executed when the button is clicked. Now let's start by adding that function. In class-based components, you now don't add a function inside of the render method, though that would technically be possible, but it wouldn't behave correctly. But instead, since this is a class, you group together functionality by grouping it all in that class. So you would simply add a method named toggle users handler, like this. There are also alternative ways of writing a method in classes, but this is the most default and standard way of defining a method. Now we have the method, but we don't have the state. And managing state worked totally different in the past with class-based components. With React 16.8, hooks were introduced, and we could use the useState hook to manage state in functional components. And it is very simple to manage state then. Prior to 16.8, class-based components were the only kind of component that could manage state. So you always had to write class-based components when you needed state. And there you basically needed to do two things: initialize and define your state, like we're doing it with useState when we first call it, and then update it when needed, like we're doing it here in the toggle users handler. Now, to define state in class-based components, you would use the constructor. The constructor function is automatically called whenever this class is instantiated, which happens when React encounters your class being used as a component. And then in the constructor, you can do initialization work, like initializing state. And this would be done by accessing this state and setting it equal to an object. And this is super crucial now. With class-based components, your state always, important, always is an object. With functional components, your state can be anything. It can be just a boolean, just a string, just a number, but it can also be an object. But it's flexible. It can be anything. With class-based components, that's not the case. Here, your state always is an object. Because with class-based components, you always group all the state slices and pieces you might need in a component into one state object. With functional components, instead, if you have multiple state pieces, you could use multiple useState calls. You could also create just one state object and group it together there, but that is optional with functional components. And I do talk about that in the state course section. With class-based components, this is not optional. There you have to group all the state that makes up a component into one object, no matter if these state pieces are closely related or not. So here we would then have our show users state and set this to true initially, let's say. And if we had more state, then we would simply add this as an extra property. You can, of course, also have nested state. You could have a nested object. You can have arrays as a state. That all works. But you have one state object which groups it all together. Then if you want to change your state, like in toggle users handler, you don't do this by accessing this state and changing it like this. That's not how you do it. Instead, you call a special method, set state. This set state and this method on this class is of course also provided by the component class we're inheriting from. This set state then also always takes an object. And this object now contains the new state you want to set, but very important, it won't override the old state, but instead React will, behind the scenes, merge the object you're passing here with your existing state. So if I had another state here, which I don't need here, but if I had that, and I then would set show users to false, show users would be set to false, but the old state would be kept. The other state would be kept because React merges this update with the existing state. It doesn't overwrite the state. And that's different with use state. Here, when you call the state updating function, you always override the old state with whatever you pass to the updating function. Unless it is a function, in which case React executes that to derive the new state. But you overwrite the old state. It's not merged automatically by React. If you would want merging, because you are managing some state object, you would have to write the logic for this on your own. With class-based components and set state, that's different. There, React merges this for you. Now here, of course, I don't always want to set this to false. I want to set it to the opposite of what it was before. And therefore here, set state, just like the state updating function from use state, also supports such a updating function. So here we can also pass a function to set state, alternatively to the object with the new state. And we should do that if our new state depends on the previous state. Nonetheless, it's not enough to just return a new state value like this, because here I would be returning something invalid because our state is an object. Instead, here we have to change this a little bit and return a new object, just as you have to pass an object to set state. If you use that function form, you have to return an object. And there I set show users to cur state show users and invert that. And again, what we return here will be merged with the old state. So this second state piece here will not be lost. And that's how we update state. Now to use it, we go down to the render method where I need my state. And here we can now access this.state.showUsers to access this state object and then the show users property, which we set up here and which we manage and update here. And we do this in all the places where we need that state. Now, of course, I also want to derive the users list. Therefore, I'll grab this constant here and add this to my render method, because we still can, of course, define helper constants like this in the render method. That all is valid and works. One last thing is missing though, and that's this method here. I added the toggle user handler method, but you don't call it by using it like this. Instead, it's a method of this class here, and therefore we need to point at this toggle user handler to point at this method part of this class. But even that wouldn't work due to how this works in JavaScript. And that has nothing to do with React. The this keyword can simply be tricky in JavaScript. Attached you find a resource which allows you to learn more about this. What you need to do in the end is you need to make sure that the this keyword inside of your method refers to the surrounding class. And it wouldn't by default when your method is called upon an event like that, like the click. So to fix this, we can, for example, use bind and bind this. which simply means that this keyword inside of this method here is now set to have the same context or the same value as the this keyword when this code is evaluated. And here the this keyword will refer to this class. Again, this is just related to how JavaScript works. It is not required in the functional component world, because there we just define a function right before we point at it. There we don't use the this keyword at all because we're not working inside of a class. With that, we can again remove the functional component or comment it out and then save everything. And now if I reload, we get an error. Must call super constructor in derived class. That is indeed true. When you add the constructor to your class and you extend another class, you need to call super, which calls the constructor of the super class, so of the class we're inheriting from. And with that, if we reload, this works, and it works as before, now with class components only. So as you can tell, it's simply a different way of writing your components. Of course, now we can also get rid of the use state import because we're not using it anymore. And as mentioned before already, you also can't use it in your class-based components. None of the React hooks can be used there.